The Adiwale mansion stood proud on Victoria Island, Lagos, its white walls gleaming in the morning sun. Behind the tall gates and perfectly trimmed flowers lived what everyone called the perfect family. Mr. Adiwale, with his expensive suits and golden wristwatch, ran one of the biggest import companies in Nigeria. His wife organized charity events that even governors' wives attended. Their children, 14-year-old Ada and 12-year-old Cain, went to the most expensive private school in Lagos. Ada was the quiet one, always lost in her books and drawings. She noticed things others missed: the way shadows moved across walls, the whispers between adults when they thought no one was listening. Kanan was different. He filled rooms with his laughter and energy, but lately, he'd started watching people with curious eyes that seemed too old for his young face. Then came Chidinma, the new maid. She wasn't like the others who had worked for them before. Something about her quick smile and quiet steps made the house feel different. Mr. Adawale started coming home earlier from work. Mrs. Adawale didn't notice. She was too busy planning her next big event. But Ada saw how her father's eyes followed Chidinma around the house. And Kane, playing with his games in the corner, saw more than anyone realized. No one knew then that their perfect world was about to crack like a mirror dropped on marble floors. Chidinma arrived on a Wednesday morning, carrying a small leather bag that looked too expensive for a maid. Her recommendation letter came from a wealthy family in Abuja. Though when Mrs. Adewale tried calling them later, the number never connected. By then, it was already too late. Unlike their previous maids who wore plain clothes and kept their eyes down, Chidinma dressed simply but elegantly. In spite of her protocol with the council, Chidinma dressed in the appropriate clothing for what could be described. Her wrapper always matched her blouse perfectly, and she walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth. She did her work well. The house had never been cleaner, the meals never more delicious. At first, the children were shy around her. But Chidinma had a way of drawing people in. She helped Ada with her homework, praising her in a soft voice that made the girl glow with pride. With Kanim, she played football in the backyard, moving with surprising skill for someone who claimed to have never played before. She knew exactly how to make each child feel special. Mr. Adiwale noticed too. His usual routine of coming home late changed. Now he would appear just as Chidinma served lunch, claiming he needed a break from the office. During these times, Ada noticed how her father's eyes followed Chidinma's movements, how his voice became softer when speaking to her. Kane saw how Chidinma would lean slightly closer than necessary when serving his father's food, her fingers brushing against the expensive fabric of his suit. In the evenings, Chidinma often worked in Mr. Adewale's study, organizing papers she claimed were too important to leave scattered. Through the half-closed door, the children sometimes heard low laughter and whispered conversations they couldn't quite understand. Mrs. Adewale, busy with her charity work and social obligations, saw nothing wrong. But in just 3 weeks, Chidinma had become more than just a maid. She had become the axis around which the house seemed to turn. The changes in Mr. Adewale started small, like raindrops before a storm. First, it was just his schedule. The man who once lived in his office now found reasons to work from home. His usual meetings became video calls he took in his study, always requesting Chidinma's presence to organize papers or bring refreshments. Ada first noticed something was different one hot afternoon. She had stayed home from school with a mild fever, sitting quietly in the garden with her book. Through the kitchen window, she saw her father come home unexpectedly. He stood too close to Chidinma as she prepared lunch, his hand resting on the counter behind her, almost but not quite touching her waist. They spoke in whispers, their faces close enough that their breaths probably mingled. Chidinma, her father's voice carried through the open window, softer than Ada had ever heard it. You've made this house so much better. The way he said it made Ada's stomach twist with an emotion she couldn't name. Kanan made his own discovery a week later. Unable to sleep, he had crept downstairs for water. Unable to freeze at the sound of hushed voices from his father's study. The door was slightly ajar, spilling a thin line of light into the dark hallway. Through the crack, he saw Chidinma, perched on the edge of his father's desk, her wrapper hiked up above her knees, as Mr. Adiwale stood between her legs, his hands where they shouldn't be. The children began watching more closely after that. They saw how their father's hands would linger when Chidinma handed him anything, his coffee, his newspaper, his mail, how he would find excuses to brush against her in hallways, how his eyes followed her movements with a hunger that made them uncomfortable. One evening, during one of their mother's charity events, Mr. Adiwale called Chidinma to his study again. Ada and Kaina, curious and confused, crept close to listen. The sounds they heard, soft moans, rustling clothes, whispered endearments, planted seeds of questions in their young minds. "What are they doing?" Kaina whispered to his sister as they huddled in the hallway. Ada's face burned with embarrassment and something else. Curiosity. "I don't know," she lied, though parts of her were beginning to understand. The next day, they watched their father at breakfast, acting normal with their mother as if nothing had happened. But now they saw how his eyes would dart to Chidinma when she entered the room, how his breath would catch slightly when she leaned over to pour his tea. The secret moments multiplied. Mr. Adwale and Chidinma thought they were careful, but children see everything. They caught glimpses of stolen kisses in the laundry room, witnessed lingering touches in the kitchen, overheard fragments of conversations that made their hearts race, with confusion and forbidden knowledge. One afternoon, playing hide-and-seek, Cain discovered them behind the garage. His father had Chidinma pressed against the wall, his mouth on her neck, her hands gripping his expensive shirt. The image burned into Cain's mind, making him feel things he didn't understand. The children started mimicking what they saw when they were alone. They would stand close like their father did with Chidinma, try to copy the way they touched, the way they looked at each other. It felt like a game at first, but something about it made their hearts beat faster, their palms sweat. "Do you think it's wrong?" Ada asked one day, after they'd tried copying a kiss they'd seen. Kene shrugged, but his eyes were troubled. "Baba does it," he said, as if that made it right. Their father's behavior became more brazen as weeks passed. He began calling Chirinmi to his room when their mother was out. The children would hear the door lock, and something in them knew they shouldn't ask questions, shouldn't speak of what they heard. But the impact of these encounters lingered in their developing minds, shaping their understanding of adult relationships, of secrecy, of what was permitted behind closed doors. They learned that love could be hidden, that touch could be secret, that what happened in shadows didn't need to be spoken of in light. And all the while, Mr. Adwale continued his dance of deception, playing the role of perfect father and husband in public, while teaching his children, through his actions, lessons that would haunt them for years to come. It began one quiet afternoon in Ada's room, where she and Kene sat cross-legged on her bed, their homework forgotten beside them. The house was silent except for the distant sounds of Chirinma working in the kitchen. The air felt heavy with unspoken thoughts and questions that had been building for weeks. "Do you think about it too?" Kene asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ada didn't need to ask what he meant. The images of their father with Chirinma had been haunting them both. "All the time," Ada admitted, pulling her knees to her chest. "I don't understand why they do it." Their first experiment was innocent enough, just standing close like they'd seen their father and Chirinma do. They giggled nervously, feeling silly but curious. "Is this how they stand?" Kenny asked, trying to remember the exact position he'd witnessed behind the garage. "No, closer," Ada said, remembering how there had been no space between her father and Chirinma in the study. They adjusted their stance, hearts beating faster, though they didn't know why. That was the beginning. Each day brought new discoveries, new attempts to understand the adult world they'd glimpsed. They created a routine of exploration, always waiting until the house was quiet, until they were sure no one would interrupt their game. Their bedroom became their laboratory. They would lock the door, a habit they'd learned from watching the adults, and try to recreate the scenes they'd witnessed. Sometimes they would pretend to be their father and Chirinma, acting out the whispered conversations they'd overheard. "You make everything better," Kene would say, mimicking their father's soft tone. "We have to be quiet," Ara would respond, copying Chirinma's breathy whisper. The physical aspects of their exploration evolved gradually. They began with simple touches, hands on waists, fingers brushing against arms just like they'd seen. Each new touch brought a mixture of excitement and confusion. Their bodies responded in ways they didn't understand, creating feelings that both thrilled and frightened them. Their behavior outside these private moments began to change. In school, Ada became withdrawn, spending break times writing in a diary she kept hidden. Her once neat handwriting became rushed and secretive, filled with questions she couldn't ask anyone. Why does it feel different when we touch like they do? Is it wrong that we want to try more? Why do we have to keep it secret if adults do it? Kane's changes were more visible. He developed an obsession with watching people, always looking for signs of secret touches, hidden glances. He became expert at moving silently through the house, at finding hiding spots where he could observe without being seen. Their explorations became more elaborate. They began timing their sessions, waiting for specific moments when they knew they wouldn't be disturbed. After school, before their mother returned from her charity work, during their father's late meetings. In the few minutes between Chirinma finishing the dinner dishes and coming to check on them. One afternoon, they took their game to the garage, the same spot where Kane had seen their father with Chirinma. The danger of being discovered added a new thrill to their exploration. They tried to position themselves exactly as they'd seen the adults do. Like this, Ada asked, her back against the wall. "No, closer," Kane said, stepping forward until there was no space between them, just like he'd seen. Their hearts raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. The sound of approaching footsteps sent them scrambling apart, giggling nervously as one of the garden workers passed by. The secrecy became part of the thrill. They developed their own code words and signals. A tug on the ear meant meet in the room. 2 taps on the desk meant someone's coming. They became experts at appearing normal while hiding their private world. But the weight of their secret began to show. Ada started having trouble sleeping, plagued by confusing dreams she couldn't understand. Kini became jumpy, startling at sudden noises or unexpected touches. They began avoiding Chirinma, unable to look her in the eye, knowing they were copying her private moments with their father. Their schoolwork suffered. Ada's art teacher noticed her drawings becoming darker, filled with shadowy figures and hidden corners. Kani's math grades dropped as he spent classes drawing detailed maps of the house, marking all the secret spots where adults met when they thought no one was watching. The guilt came in waves. Sometimes, usually right after their games, they would feel sick with shame, promising each other they would stop. But the curiosity always won out, drawing them back to their exploration like moths to a flame. They began pushing boundaries, each new discovery leading to more questions, more experiments. They tried kissing like they'd seen through the study door, touching like they'd witnessed in the kitchen. Each new action brought a mixture of excitement and confusion, their young minds struggling to process feelings their bodies weren't ready for. "Do you think Mama knows?" Ada asked one day, after they'd finished one of their sessions. "No," Keen said confidently. Adults don't see anything they don't want to see. Their private world grew more complex. They started keeping a journal of their discoveries, writing down what they'd seen adults do and what they'd tried themselves. The notebook became their guide, hidden carefully under Ada's mattress where their mother never looked during her cleaning. But underneath their curiosity and exploration, questions nagged at them. Why did their father only touch Chirinma when Mama wasn't home? Why did everyone pretend not to see what was happening? Was what they were doing just as wrong as what the adults were doing in secret? The confusion bled into their daily lives. Ada stopped changing clothes in front of her friends at swimming practice. Keen stopped wrestling with his school friends, uncomfortable with any kind of touch that reminded him of their secret games. Their bond, once innocent and purely sibling-like, transformed into something different, something shadowed by adult behaviors they'd witnessed but couldn't understand. They became each other's confidants, partners in exploration, keepers of secrets that grew heavier each day. Yet they couldn't stop. The need to understand, to explore, to make sense of the adult world they'd glimpsed drove them forward. Each new discovery, each new experiment, pulled them deeper into a world they weren't ready for, leaving marks on their young psyches that would take years to heal. Mrs. Adewale first noticed something was wrong during a family dinner. Ada, usually eager to share stories about school, barely touched her food, her eyes fixed on her plate. When Chidinma leaned over to serve the soup, both children stiffened, a reaction so subtle that only a mother's eyes could catch it. The changes had been gradual, like shadows lengthening at sunset. Ada no longer sang in the shower or left her bedroom door open while doing homework. Keen, once a bundle of endless energy, now moved through the house like a ghost, pressing himself against walls when adults passed by. The children seemed different lately, she mentioned to her husband one evening as he prepared for bed. Have you noticed? Mr. Adewale barely looked up from his phone. They're growing up, he said dismissively. All children go through phases. But maternal instinct told her it was more than just growing pains. She began paying closer attention, noting small details that had escaped her before. How Ada would suddenly go quiet when Chidinma entered a room. How Keene's eyes would follow their father with a strange intensity. During her weekly charity committee meeting, she found herself distracted, thinking about the way Ada had flinched that morning when Chidinma touched her shoulder. Are you all right? Her friend asked, noticing her unusual silence. Just worried about the children, she admitted. They're not themselves lately. That afternoon, she came home early, surprising everyone. The house had a strange tension she'd never noticed before. Through the kitchen window, she saw Chidinma and her husband in what appeared to be an intense discussion, though they jumped apart when she entered. The quarterly reports, Mr. Adewale explained quickly. I was just asking about where she filed them. Her suspicions grew stronger each day. The children's teachers began calling with concerns. Ada's English teacher reported she had stopped participating in class discussions. Keene's math grades were dropping, and his teacher found disturbing doodles in his notebook margins. At home, the changes became more obvious. The children spent more time in their rooms with the door locked, something they had never done before. When she knocked, there would be hurried whispers and shuffling sounds before they answered. She started paying more attention to daily life in her home. Each day brought new worries, Ada's sudden silence at meal times, Keene's refusal to play with his friends, the way both children seemed to disappear into their rooms for hours, the way her husband seemed distracted, always finding reasons to be in his study when Chidinma was working. The evidence of change mounted, but every time she tried to discuss it with her husband, he grew defensive. You're imagining things, he would say, his voice sharp with irritation. Focus on your charity work. Let me handle the household. One afternoon, while tidying Ada's room, she found a notebook filled with writings that made her heart stop. The words spoke of secrets, of things children shouldn't know about. When she confronted Ada, her daughter burst into tears and ran from the room. That evening, she tried again to talk to her husband. Something is wrong with our children, she insisted. We need to get help. Nothing is wrong, he snapped, slamming his hand on his desk. Stop creating problems where there aren't any. His reaction only strengthened her resolve to watch more carefully. She began rearranging her schedule to be home more often. She noticed how family dynamics had shifted. Meals were silent affairs now, heavy with unspoken tensions. The children jumped at small sounds, exchanged glances full of secrets. She observed changes in everyone's routines. Her husband, who once worked late most evenings, now came home early but spent hours in his study. Chidinma moved through the house with unusual confidence, as if she knew secrets about the family that gave her power. The children's behavior became more concerning. Ada stopped going to her beloved dance classes. Keena quit the soccer team he had once loved. Both began showing signs of anxiety, Ada biting her nails until they bled, Keen developing a stutter when speaking to adults. One night, unable to sleep, She heard strange sounds from the children's room. When she knocked, there was panic in their voices before they opened the door, both looking flushed and nervous. "What's going on?" she asked. "Nothing, Mama," they said in unison, their voices too practiced, too careful. She tried talking to them individually, but they had become expert at avoiding her questions. Ada would change the subject, talking about homework or friends. Keen would suddenly remember errands he had to run. The final straw came when she received a call from the school counselor. Both children had been showing signs of distress. Ada had been caught crying in the bathroom between classes. Keen had gotten into a fight when another boy tried to touch his shoulder. That night, she confronted her husband again. "We need to talk about what's happening in this house," she said firmly. "Nothing is happening," he shouted, but she saw fear in his eyes. "Stop trying to destroy our perfect family." Perfect. The word echoed in her mind as she lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of her house. Perfect families don't have locked doors and secret whispers. Perfect children don't flinch at innocent touches. Perfect husbands don't avoid their wives' eyes when talking about the maid. She knew then that she couldn't ignore her instincts any longer. Something dark was growing in her home, something that was hurting her children. And no matter what it cost her, she would find out what it was. The discovery came on a quiet Tuesday evening. Mrs. Adewale had cancelled her charity meeting, driven home by a gnawing feeling that she couldn't ignore any longer. The house was unusually still when she arrived, the setting sun casting long shadows through the windows. She climbed the stairs slowly, her heart pounding with each step. The children's door was closed, as it so often was these days. But this time, instead of knocking, she stood listening. The sounds she heard made her blood run cold, whispers, movements, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. It was locked, of course. Using the master key she'd gotten from the carpenter that morning, she took a deep breath and opened the door. What she saw shattered her world. Ada and Keen sprang apart, their faces masks of terror and shame. The room seemed to spin as Mrs. Adewale gripped the doorframe for support. "Mama." Ada's voice cracked, tears already streaming down her face. "What? What is happening here?" Mrs. Adewale's voice came out as a whisper, though she wanted to scream. Keen started sobbing, his whole body shaking. We were just what?" Their mother's voice rose sharply. "What were you doing?" The silence that followed was deafening. "Mrs. Adewale staggered into the room, her legs barely supporting her. She sank onto Ada's bed, her mind refusing to process what she'd witnessed. "How long?" she managed to ask. "How long has this been happening?" Ada and Keen exchanged glances, a habit they'd developed over months of shared secrets. It was Ada who finally spoke, her voice small and broken. Since we saw Baba with Chidima?" The words hit Mrs. Adewale like a physical blow. "What?" Kenny's words came out in a rush now, as if a dam had broken. "We saw them, Mama. In his study, in the kitchen, behind the garage. We saw how they touched each other, how they whispered. We thought if Baba did it, it must be okay," Ada finished, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Adewale felt bile rise in her throat. The pieces were falling into place, all the changes, all the secrets, all the signs she'd tried to ignore. She pulled herself to her feet. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Don't move." She found her husband in his study, Chidinma standing suspiciously close to his desk. The sight that had once made her uneasy now filled her with fury. "What have you done?" she screamed, making both of them jump. "What have you done to my children?" Mr. Adewale stood quickly, confusion written across his face. "What are you talking about? Our children," she spat the words. "Our children have been. She couldn't bring herself to say it. "Because of you. Because of what they saw you doing with her." She pointed at Chidinma, who had backed against the wall. "Madam, I don't understand," Chidinma began, but Mrs. Adewale cut her off. Don't you dare speak." She turned back to her husband. "Come upstairs, both of you. Now." The confrontation that followed in the children's room would haunt them all forever. As the truth spilled out, piece by horrible piece, Mrs. Adewale watched her husband's face transform from confusion to horror to shame. Ada and Keen, huddled together on Keen's bed, told their story in broken fragments. How they'd first seen Chidinma with their father, How they'd been confused and curious. How they'd started their own exploration, trying to understand what they'd witnessed. "We made it a game," Keen said, his voice hollow. "Like how Baba and Chidinma played their game." Mr. Adewale collapsed into a chair, his face ashen. Chidinma stood frozen by the door, tears streaming down her face. "Get out," Mrs. Adewale told her, her voice deadly calm. "Pack your things and get out of my house. Now." As Chidinma fled the room, Mrs. Adewale turned to her children. "What exactly did you see? Tell me everything." The story came out in painful detail. Every incident they'd witnessed, every moment they'd tried to recreate. With each revelation, Mr. Adewale seemed to shrink further into himself. "I never thought," he started. "No, you didn't think," Mrs. Adewale exploded. "You didn't think about your children. You didn't think about what your actions would teach them. You didn't think about anything except your own selfish desires." She gathered Ada and Keen into her arms, their tears soaking her dress. "This ends now," she said firmly. "Tomorrow, we're getting help. Professional help. All of us." Mr. Adewale nodded weakly, unable to look at his children. "And you," she turned to him, her voice cold, "you will tell me everything. Every detail of your relationship with Chidinma. I need to know what my children saw so we can help them heal." That night, as the children finally slept, sedated by the family doctor, Mrs. Adewale sat in the kitchen with her husband. The confession she drew from him was as painful as she'd feared. Each revelation was another knife in her heart, another piece of their children's innocence destroyed. "How could you not see what you were doing to them?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "How could you be so blind?" "I thought we were careful," he whispered. "I thought no one knew." "Children see everything," she said. "They learn from everything. And now look what they've learned from you." The next morning, she made 3 phone calls, one to a child psychologist, one to a family therapist, and one to a lawyer. She wasn't sure yet what she would do about her marriage, but her priority was clear. Her children needed help, and they needed it now. When Ada and Keen woke, she sat with them, holding their hands as she explained what happened next. There would be therapy sessions, both individual and as a family. There would be new rules about privacy and boundaries. Most importantly, there would be no more secrets. "What happened to you was not your fault," she told them firmly. "The adults in your life failed you. We failed to protect you, to guide you, to show you right from wrong. But that changes now." The shame in their eyes broke her heart, but she saw something else too, relief. The weight of their secret had been crushing them, and now, finally, they could begin to breathe again. As she held her children, watching the morning sun paint shadows across their tear-stained faces, Mrs. Adewale made a silent promise. She would rebuild their innocence, piece by broken piece. She would help them understand what had happened to them, and why it was wrong. She would guide them back to the light, no matter how long it took. The weeks following the discovery brought many changes to the Adewale household. The large house, once filled with secrets, began its slow transformation into a place of healing. Chidinma was gone, leaving behind only the painful lessons of what happens when boundaries are broken and trust is betrayed. The family's first therapy session was the hardest. Ada and Keen sat close to their mother, unable to look at their father. The therapist, Dr. Okoro, had a gentle voice and kind eyes that helped them feel safe enough to speak. She explained that healing would take time, but with patience and honesty, they could become whole again. "What happened wasn't your fault," Dr. Okoro told the children. "You were trying to understand things that adults should have protected you from seeing." Mr. Adewale, broken by the damage his actions had caused, committed himself to change. He moved into the guest room, giving his children the space they needed. Each morning he would leave a note under their doors, not asking for forgiveness, but promising to be better, to be the father they deserved. Mrs. Adewale arranged separate counseling for each family member. The children learned about appropriate boundaries and healthy relationships. She focused on healing her own trauma while learning how to better protect and guide her children. Mr. Adewale worked through his issues with a specialist, understanding how his choices had affected his entire family. Slowly, very slowly, things began to change. Ada started singing again, softly at first, then with growing confidence. Keen returned to playing soccer, though it took time before he felt comfortable with physical contact during games. Their school grades improved as the weight of their secret lifted. Family dinner became a time for open conversation. They talked about their therapy sessions, their feelings, their fears, and their hopes. No topic was forbidden, but now they discussed things appropriately, with guidance and understanding. Remember, Mrs. Adewale would say, in this house, we don't keep secrets anymore. We share our worries, our questions, and our problems. The hardest lesson was one they all had to learn: parents' actions shape their children's world. What adults do in secret, children often discover and try to understand in their own ways. The Adewales learned that every action, every choice, every moment witnessed becomes part of a child's understanding of the world. 6 months after that terrible evening, the family sat together in their garden. The same garden where so much had started, now replanted with new flowers and fresh hope. Ada and Keen played a board game while their parents watched, grateful for each small sign of returning innocence. The shadows are getting shorter, Mr. Adewale observed quietly to his wife, watching their children laugh together, this time with pure joy. Mrs. Adewale nodded. Yes, but we must never forget what those shadows taught us. Our children deserve nothing less than our best selves. The Adewale family's story became their strength, a reminder that healing is possible when truth replaces secrets, when professional help replaces silence, and when parents put their children's well-being above all else. They learned that love means protecting innocence, respecting boundaries, and creating a home where children can grow up feeling safe and understood. Years later, the Adewale house still stands in Lagos, though it looks different now. The high walls have been replaced with lower fences, letting in more light. The garden blooms with new flowers, and children's laughter echoes through open windows. But the lessons learned within those walls remain as important as ever. Every parent carries a sacred responsibility. Children watch, learn, and mirror the world adults create around them. They absorb not just the lessons we mean to teach, but the ones hidden in our actions, our choices, and our secrets. Like sensitive instruments, they pick up signals we don't even know we're sending. The Adewale family's journey reminds us that a child's innocence is precious and fragile. Once broken, it can be mended, but the process requires dedication, professional help, and unwavering commitment to change. Their story teaches us that healing is possible when we face our mistakes honestly and work together to create a safer, healthier environment for our children. In the end, every home is a classroom, and parents are the first teachers. The question isn't whether our children are learning from us, they always are. The question is, what are we teaching them through our actions? Let their story be a reminder. The future we create for our children begins with the examples we set today.